Hello there, and welcome to the Nightcap Historian channel. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that existed for 3,000 years before it finally let go, a civilization so vast, so strange, and so luminous that it still reaches forward through time and touches us here, now, in the quiet of this room, ancient Egypt, a land where the sun was a god who died every evening and was reborn every dawn, where the dead were more carefully tended than the living, where a river, one single, impossible river, made a strip of green life in the middle of a desert that stretched to the edge of the world. If you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear it, the low murmur of the Nile at night, the papyrus stalks whispering in the dark, the smell of warm stone releasing the day's heat into the cooling air. Before we begin, I want you to let your shoulders drop. Just notice them and release. Unclench your jaw if it's been holding on to anything from the day. Take one slow breath in through your nose and let it drift out without effort. You don't need to follow along perfectly. You don't need to remember any of this. Tonight, your only job is to let the world of ancient Egypt wash over you the way the Nile washed over its banks every year, slowly, thoroughly, leaving something rich behind. Let the day loosen its grip. The pyramids have been standing for 4,000 years. They'll still be there when you wake up. For now, let's settle in. Let the desert wind carry us back, and let Egypt do what it has always done, endure. If you found your way here tonight, perhaps through a sleepless hour or a restless mind searching for something calm and large and ancient, I'm genuinely honored. This channel exists for exactly that. The tired and the curious and the ones who need something beautiful to fall asleep to. If it helps you, consider subscribing so that other sleepy travelers can find their way here too. But for now, let's begin. Egypt did not begin with pharaohs. It began with water. Long before the first dynasty, before the pyramids, before the hieroglyphs, the Sahara was green. Around 10,000 years ago, what is now the world's largest desert was a place of lakes and rivers, grasslands and grazing animals. Nomadic people moved across it freely, following the rains. Picture them. Small groups of humans beneath an open sky, watching hippos move through shallow water in a landscape that no longer exists. Then the rains shifted, the green dried out, and the people moved east, toward the only water that remained, toward the Nile. That migration, driven by climate change 10 millennia ago, is what created ancient Egypt. The Nile is unlike any other river in the world. It flows north, from the African interior toward the Mediterranean, a distance of over 4,000 miles, the longest river on Earth. Every year, without fail, it flooded, not in a destructive, terrifying way, but in a generous, almost parental way. The floodwaters rose in July, peaked in September, and receded by November, leaving behind a thick layer of dark, nutrient-rich silt across the farmland. The Egyptians called this black soil the Kemet, the Black Land, and they called the desert beyond it the Deshret, the Red Land. Their entire world, their entire civilization, was the thin green strip between those two things. Imagine living your whole life knowing that on one side lay abundance, and on the other lay death. The Nile's flood was generous, but it was not guaranteed. When the flood was too low, crops failed and famine followed. When it was too high, villages were swept away. The ancient Egyptians lived in a state of profound dependence on something they could not control, and that dependence shaped everything about them. Their religion was an elaborate attempt to understand and cooperate with the forces of nature. Their gods were not distant or abstract. They were the flood, the sun, the desert wind. They were the crocodile that took children from the riverbank and the ibis that walked through the shallows with such deliberate calm. Egypt's spiritual life grew from the same soil as its crops, practical, urgent, and deeply tied to the physical world. The ancient Egyptians had a god for almost everything, but some of their divine choices were particularly unexpected. Bes was a dwarf god with a lion's mane, and his tongue permanently stuck out, and he was the protector of households, mothers in childbirth, and sleeping children. Statues of Bez were placed in bedrooms. He was beloved and ugly and deeply comforting. Consider a mother in ancient Thebes, 3,000 years ago, placing a small clay Bez figure beside her sleeping child, trusting this peculiar, tongue-waggling deity to stand guard through the night. Some things about being human have not changed at all. Egypt's history is divided into three great periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, each separated by intermediate periods of instability. The Old Kingdom lasted from roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE. This is the age of the Great Pyramids. The Middle Kingdom, from around 2055 to 1650 BCE, was a period of cultural renaissance and expansion into Nubia. The New Kingdom, from 1550 to 1070 BCE, produced Egypt's most famous pharaohs: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses II. After the New Kingdom came centuries of decline, foreign conquest, and eventual absorption into the Roman Empire in 30 BCE. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, contained in those three periods longer than the gap between ancient Rome and us. The word pharaoh comes from the Egyptian para, meaning great house, a reference, originally, not to the king himself but to the royal palace. Over time, it became a title, and eventually a word that carried the weight of divinity itself. The pharaoh was not just a ruler. He was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god, son of the sun god Ra. When he died, he became Osiris, lord of the dead, and his successor became the new Horus. The pharaoh was the hinge between the human world and the divine one, the point at which the visible and invisible touched. Imagine what it meant to stand in the presence of such a person, to see them processed through a temple in robes of white linen, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, while the incense smoke rose in silence around them. Egypt was unified, Upper and Lower Egypt brought together into a single kingdom around 3100 BCE by a king the later tradition called Narmer, or possibly Menes. The details are debated, but the moment itself is recorded on one of the oldest pieces of political art in the world, the Narmer palette, a ceremonial slate object showing a king smiting enemies and wearing the crowns of both lands. It is not quite 2 feet tall. It sits in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. You could hold it in your hands if you were standing in that room, this small, dense, carved stone that marks the beginning of one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Something about that smallness is moving. The biggest stories start in modest objects. Unification was not a peaceful negotiation. Archaeology suggests that the consolidation of Egypt under a single ruler involved warfare, conquest, and the subjugation of local chieftains who had no interest in being absorbed. The decorated mace heads and palettes from this period show scenes of captive prisoners, of kings executing enemies, of cities being taken. Egypt's origin story, like most origin stories, contains violence beneath the mythology. The later tradition preferred to frame unification as a divine act, the gods themselves ordering the Black Land and the Red Land into harmony. But the people who actually lived through it experienced something messier and more human. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness. Priests shaved their entire body's head, eyebrows, everything, and bathed multiple times a day to maintain ritual purity. Ordinary Egyptians bathed in the Nile or in basins at home, and used a paste made from natron salt and animal fat as a kind of soap. They cleaned their teeth with a powder made from ground ox hooves, eggshells, and pumice. They used breath-freshening pellets made from honey, cinnamon, and myrrh. Picture a market in ancient Memphis, 5,000 years ago, and a vendor selling little breath mints made from ingredients that modern perfumers still use today. The gap between them and us collapses for a moment, and it is slightly wonderful. Hieroglyphics, Egypt's famous picture writing system, was not a simple alphabet. It was a complex system combining logographic signs, pictures representing whole words, phonetic signs, pictures representing sounds, and determinatives, signs, at the end of words indicating their category. There were over 700 individual hieroglyphic signs in regular use during the classical period. The system was so complex that literacy was the exclusive domain of a professional class of scribes. To become a scribe required years of training, beginning in childhood. Boys, and very occasionally girls, would learn to write by copying texts over and over on sheets of limestone or pottery shards, saving the expensive papyrus for finished work. The word scribe in Egyptian was sesh, and to be a sesh was to be powerful in a world where almost no one else could read. We have been in Egypt for a little while now, walking its riverbanks, learning its language, meeting its gods. Take a moment to notice what that has done to your body. Your breathing has probably slowed. The day that was pressing against you when you first lay down has grown a little more distant. That is the gift of deep time. It reminds us that whatever we are carrying tonight is small against 5,000 years of human story. Settle a little deeper. Let your weight find the surface beneath you. Let Egypt keep going. Let's continue. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2650 BCE, is the world's first large-scale stone structure. Before Djoser's architect, Imhotep, designed this building, monumental construction was done in mud brick. Imhotep, who was later deified, worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom, had the audacious idea of stacking mastabas, the flat-topped tomb structures of the early dynasties, on top of each other in diminishing tiers. The result was a stepped pyramid rising about 200 feet above the desert plain, visible for miles, surrounded by a complex of temples and courts and corridors all built in stone. When the workers who built it first saw the completed structure, they were looking at something that had never existed before in the history of the world. Imhotep himself is one of history's most extraordinary figures. He served as vizier chief minister to the pharaoh Djoser, and his titles included high priest, chief architect, physician, and sage. He was the first named architect in recorded history. He wrote medical texts. He designed what may be the world's first colonnade, a row of stone columns imitating the bundled papyrus reeds that had previously been used as building supports. 2,000 years after his death, the Greeks identified him with Asclepius, their own god of medicine, a commoner who rose to such heights that he was eventually worshipped as divine. Imhotep's story is, in some ways, the most Egyptian story of all. The belief that excellence could transcend the boundaries of human existence. The construction of Egypt's pyramids required an enormous workforce. For a long time, it was assumed that this workforce consisted of slaves, a narrative reinforced by Hollywood and popular imagination. The truth is considerably more nuanced and, in some ways, more interesting. Archaeological evidence from the workmen's village at Giza, discovered in the 1990s, shows that the pyramid builders were paid workers, skilled craftsmen, and their support staff, who received regular rations of bread and beer, had access to medical care, and were buried with honors when they died on the job. The graffiti they left behind on stone blocks is playful and proud. Gangs of workers name themselves things like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. These were not enslaved people building in misery. They were workers with identity and solidarity and, occasionally, a sense of humor. Workers on the pyramids received a beer ration of about 4 to 5 liters per day. This was not considered excessive. Beer in ancient Egypt was closer to a nutritional supplement than an intoxicant, being thick, low in alcohol, and full of carbohydrates and B vitamins. It was made from fermented bread and was consumed through a tube to filter out the sediment. Consider the logistics of this. Tens of thousands of workers, each drinking 4 liters of thick, warm, fermented grain liquid a day. Somewhere in the organizational structure of the pyramid project was a person whose entire job was to manage beer supply. That person's job was, in one sense, among the most important roles in the construction of the most famous structures on Earth. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BCE, is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and the only one still standing. It was originally 481 feet tall, making it the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the completion of Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 CE. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of 2.5 to 15 tons each. The base covers about 13 acres and is level to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire length. The precision with which the pyramid is oriented to true north is within 0.05 degrees of arc. These numbers do not get smaller the more you look at them. They only get more astonishing. How the pyramids were built remains one of history's most tantalizing questions, not because the answer is mysterious, but because the specifics are still being refined. The broad picture is understood. A massive organized labor force, a sophisticated system of ramps and sledges and rollers, an extraordinary logistical apparatus supplying food, tools, and materials, and a central administration capable of coordinating it all over decades. What we still debate is the details, the exact geometry of the ramps, the methods for lifting the heaviest stones, the organization of the workforce across different phases. Imagine the noise of it. Thousands of people hauling stone across desert sand, the rhythmic shouts of work gangs keeping time, the crack of copper chisels on limestone, the whole Giza plateau alive with the sound of something being made that would outlast almost everything. The pharaoh Khufu, who ordered the Great Pyramid built, is something of an enigma. Despite commissioning the largest stone structure ever built, almost nothing personal is known about him. The only confirmed portrait is a tiny ivory figurine, less than 3 inches tall, found at Abydos in 1903. It shows a seated king wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, barely larger than a thumb. The man who built the largest structure on Earth is remembered by an object small enough to fit in your closed fist. History does this. Sometimes it loses the person inside the monument. Khufu himself had thoughts and fears and preferences, and probably a sense of humor. He had people he loved, and almost none of that survived the 4,500 years between his death and this night. The pyramid complex at Giza was not just a tomb, it was a machine for transformation. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition, and that the physical preparations made for the deceased determined the quality of their existence in the afterlife. The pyramid protected the royal body, the burial chamber preserved the physical remains, and the elaborate funerary rituals recited spells, ritual meals. The opening of the mouth ceremony allowed the dead person's spirit to move freely between the worlds. But for all this preparation, the pyramids largely failed at their practical function of protecting their royal occupants. Every major pyramid was robbed in antiquity, some within decades of sealing. The priests knew this was coming. They responded by building false corridors, plugging passages with granite, disguising entrances. It rarely worked. The treasure hunters were patient and methodical and understood the architecture almost as well as the builders. Ancient Egypt had cats, and ancient Egypt loved cats. The goddess Bastet, originally depicted as a lioness, later as a domestic cat, was one of Egypt's most popular deities, associated with home, fertility, and protection. Cats were kept as pets from at least 2000 BCE and were treated with extraordinary reverence. When a household cat died, family members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death, a fact reported by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who claimed to have witnessed a Roman soldier mobbed by an Egyptian crowd for accidentally killing a cat. The ancient Egyptians would find nothing surprising about the modern internet's obsession with cat videos. They would, if anything, find our devotion insufficient. Egyptian medicine was among the most advanced in the ancient world. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dated to around 1600 BCE but thought to be copied from a much older text, describes 48 cases of injury and trauma with a clinical precision that still impresses modern physicians. It categorizes wounds as treatable, possibly treatable, or not treatable, a triage system. It describes the brain in detail, noting that damage to it causes symptoms throughout the body, one of the earliest recorded descriptions of neurological function. Egyptian physicians could set broken bones, perform dental extractions, drain abscesses, and stitch wounds. They used honey as an antibacterial agent and moldy bread as an antibiotic, practices that modern science has since validated. The gap between ancient intuition and modern knowledge is sometimes smaller than we imagine. The religion of ancient Egypt was not a fixed, static thing. Over 3,000 years, gods rose and fell in prominence, merged with each other, changed their roles and attributes, were adopted from neighboring cultures and given Egyptian names. What remained constant was the fundamental structure, the universe as a place of dynamic balance between order and chaos, between creation and destruction, between the living and the dead. The Egyptians called this balance Ma'at, a word that translates as truth, justice, order, and harmony simultaneously. Ma'at was also a goddess, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather in her hair. After death, the deceased's heart was weighed against her feather on a scale. If the heart was heavy or weighted down by wrongdoing, a beast called Ammit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, devoured it, and the soul was destroyed. If the heart balanced, the soul passed on. Imagine standing at that scale. Imagine what it meant to have lived all your life in awareness of that moment. Ma'at was not only a cosmic principle, it was a daily responsibility. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh down to the poorest farmer, was expected to live in accordance with Ma'at. This meant honesty, generosity, fairness, caring for the vulnerable. The negative confession, recited by the soul before the scales of judgment, lists 42 things the deceased claims not to have done. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not made anyone weep. I have not acted with arrogance. I have not been deaf to words of truth. It reads less like a religious declaration and more like an ethical self-examination, a list of ways a person could fall short of the life they hope to have lived. Picture an elderly woman in ancient Memphis, lying in her last illness, quietly going through that list in her memory, weighing her life against its ideals. The life of ordinary Egyptians was harder than the monuments suggest. Farmers who worked the black soil of the Nile Valley lived in small mud brick houses with few possessions, worked long days in the fields during planting and harvest, and paid taxes and grain to the state. The average life expectancy was around 35 years. Though this figure is skewed by high infant mortality, those who survived childhood might live into their 50s or 60s. Dental disease was nearly universal, caused largely by the grit from stone-ground flour that wore down teeth to the root. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease spread by contact with Nile water, was endemic and debilitating. The grandeur of Egypt was real, but it was built on the quiet endurance of millions of people whose names were never carved in stone. Ancient Egyptians played board games. Senet, one of the oldest board games in the world, with a history going back to at least 3,100 BCE, was so popular that boards were placed in tombs so the deceased could play in the afterlife. The game involved moving pieces along a track of 30 squares, with the objective of moving all your pieces off the board first. The rules are not fully understood, but the game appears to have had religious significance, with the board representing the journey through the underworld. Queen Nefertari is depicted playing Senet in a painting in her tomb. So is Tutankhamun. Boards were found among his burial goods. Somewhere between strategy game and spiritual practice, Senet was Egypt's chess, its backgammon, its quiet evening entertainment beside the river. You can still buy reproductions of it today. The Egyptian calendar had 3 seasons, not 4, corresponding to the agricultural cycle driven by the Nile. Akhet, the inundation season, when the floodwaters covered the fields. Peret, the growing season, when crops were planted in the receding flood's rich deposits. And Shemu, the harvest season, when the grain was brought in. Each season lasted 4 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the year's end that were considered the birthdays of the major gods, Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. This gave a civil year of 365 days. It was not perfectly accurate. It drifted against the solar year by about 6 hours annually, but it was one of the first formal calendars in history, and it forms the basis of the calendar we still use today. The god Ra, the sun, was the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon for most of the civilization's history. Each morning, Ra was born in the east as the scarab god Khepri. He crossed the sky in his solar boat, aging through the day until he set in the west as Atum, the old sun. During the night, he passed through the underworld, the Duat battling the chaos serpent Apep, who tried every night to swallow him and prevent the sun from rising. The priests in the temples performed rituals throughout the night to support Ra in this struggle, chanting spells and burning incense to strengthen him against the dark. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, believing that the sun's return each morning depended, in part, on your vigilance. And imagine the relief, every morning, when it worked. Egyptian temples were not churches in the modern sense, places where congregations gathered to worship together. They were houses of the gods, tended by a professional priesthood on behalf of the people. The inner sanctuary of a temple, where the divine statue resided, was accessible only to the highest-ranking priests. Ordinary Egyptians worshipped at small household shrines or at the temple's outer courts during festivals. But the great festivals were public and celebratory processions that carried the divine statue through the city in a gilded bark, accompanied by music, dancing, food, and enormous crowds. Picture the festival of Opet in ancient Thebes, the statue of Amun being carried by priests from Karnak Temple down the avenue of Sphinxes to Luxor Temple, while the entire population of the city lined the route, and musicians played and dancers spun, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. The god Osiris tells one of mythology's oldest and darkest stories. Osiris was the good king, the civilizer, the teacher of agriculture and law. His brother, Set, god of chaos, desert, and storms, murdered him out of jealousy, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Osiris's wife, Isis, searched the land for the pieces, reassembled them, and through her magic conceived a posthumous son, Horus. This myth was the foundation of Egyptian beliefs about death and resurrection. Osiris became lord of the dead, and every deceased person was identified with Osiris in the afterlife. But it is also a story about grief and love and the refusal to accept loss. Isis searching the dark land for pieces of her husband is one of the oldest recorded images of what it means to love someone too much to let them go. Egypt had professional mourners. At the funerals of the wealthy, women were hired specifically to wail, weep, beat their chests, throw dust in their hair, and demonstrate elaborate grief that the family might be too composed or insufficiently numerous to produce on their own. These women were called Jeret, and their role was considered both practical and spiritually important. The louder and more elaborate the lamentation, the more honored the deceased, and the better their prospects in the afterlife. Consider the professional mourner arriving for a day's work, perhaps eating a quick breakfast of bread and figs, then throwing herself into theatrical sobbing that she would sustain for hours, a deeply human intersection of sincere belief and practical employment. Mummification, the preservation of the body for the afterlife, was a sophisticated process that took approximately 70 days. First, the brain was removed through the nostrils using a hooked instrument, and discarded. The ancient Egyptians did not consider the brain to be the seat of thought or personality. That was the heart's job. The internal organs were removed through an incision in the left side, washed, treated with natron salt, wrapped in linen, and placed in 4 canopic jars under the protection of 4 sons of Horus. The body cavity was then packed with natron and left to desiccate for 40 days. After that, it was washed, oiled, packed with linen and sawdust to restore its shape, wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages with amulets placed between the layers, and sealed with a mask. The heart was left in the body it would be needed for the weighing ceremony. And Asir, we are moving through the layers of Egypt now, the gods and the pyramids, the living and the dead, the farmers and the pharaohs. Pause for a moment and feel where your body is. Notice the weight of your limbs, the rise and fall of your breathing. You don't need to hold any of this. Let it drift through you, the way river water moves through, reeds present, flowing, unhurried. The night is long. Egypt is patient. Let's continue. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, was Egypt's imperial age, the period of its greatest power, wealth, and territorial extent. Egyptian armies marched into Nubia to the south and into the Levant to the northeast, creating an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the Euphrates River. The tribute that poured into Egypt from subject peoples and conquered territories was staggering. Gold, ivory, exotic animals, slaves, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the fragrant resins of Arabia. Thebes' modern Luxor became the greatest city in the world, its temples swollen with wealth, its population enormous by ancient standards, its streets busy with merchants and soldiers, and priests and scribes and artisans from across the known world. Hatshepsut was one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable rulers, a woman who declared herself pharaoh and ruled for approximately 20 years, from around 1473 to 1458 BCE. She was not the first female ruler of Egypt, but she was the most successful, presiding over a period of enormous prosperity and artistic achievement. She commissioned ambitious building projects, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. She organized a trading expedition to the distant land of Punt, probably somewhere in the Horn of Africa, and brought back myrrh trees, ebony, and gold. She is depicted in her official monuments as a male pharaoh, wearing the double crown and the false beard of kingship. After her death, her successor Thutmose III, possibly her nephew, had her name and image systematically removed from monuments across Egypt. It did not work. She endured. The life of a soldier in Egypt's New Kingdom armies was one of the ancient world's more brutal occupations. Campaigns into Nubia and the Levant meant marching through desert and mountain, fighting hand-to-hand with infantry spears, bows, and battle axes, besieging fortified cities in the summer heat. The wounded received some medical care but died often from infection. The spoils of war, slaves, cattle, land went largely to the officers and the pharaoh. Ordinary soldiers received rations and the occasional plot of land on retirement. Accounts of major battles like Megiddo and Kadesh describe the chaos and danger of ancient warfare with a frankness that later, more sanitized, histories sometimes lose. The men who built Egypt's empire were not abstractions. They had families at home. They were afraid. They did it anyway. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his military campaigns and strategic brilliance, was also an avid botanist. After his campaigns in Syria and the Levant, he commissioned detailed botanical and zoological illustrations of the plants and animals he encountered, carved in relief on the walls of a chamber at Karnak Temple, one of the earliest known examples of scientific illustration. The chamber shows plants and animals unknown in Egypt: Syrian birds, Syrian flowers, Syrian fish. An inscription beside them notes that Thutmose brought them back, so that all the plants that grow and all the flowers that are in God's land could be known. Beneath the warrior king was a man who stopped on military campaigns to look at flowers. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, was one of the largest chariot battles in history. Both sides deployed thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of infantry along the Orontes River in what is now Syria. The battle was effectively a draw, though both sides claimed victory in their official accounts. What followed was even more historically significant than the battle. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed around 1259 BCE, is the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world. A copy of it, in cuneiform, is displayed at the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of diplomacy. The oldest recorded act of international negotiation was between ancient Egypt and the Hittites, carved in clay, surviving 40 centuries. Ramesses the Great ruled Egypt for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, and was so central to Egyptian consciousness that 9 subsequent pharaohs took his name. He built more temples than any other pharaoh, commissioned more statues of himself than any other Egyptian king, fathered somewhere between 90 and over 100 children, and lived to approximately 90 years of age in a world where most people died before 40. His mummy, discovered in 1881, shows a tall man with a long nose and reddish hair dyed with henna, suggesting he was vain about his appearance even in death. His mummy was issued an Egyptian passport in 1976, so it could be transported to France for restoration, listing his occupation as king deceased. Some dignities are non-negotiable. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor at ancient Thebes were not built in a single moment. They grew across centuries, each pharaoh adding a hall, a pylon, an obelisk, a sanctuary, until the complex at Karnak became the largest religious building ever constructed, covering over 200 acres. The hypostyle hall alone, a forest of 134 massive carved columns, the tallest rising 70 feet, covers 54,000 square feet, an area larger than Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Imagine walking into it for the first time as an ancient Egyptian, having never seen a building of this scale. The columns would seem like trees in an impossible stone forest, the shadows between them deep and cool, the walls alive with painted scenes of gods and pharaohs in battle, the experience of architecture as the sublime that is ancient. The Amarna period, the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, represents one of Egypt's strangest and most disruptive episodes. Akhenaten abandoned the traditional Egyptian pantheon and declared that only one god was to be worshipped, the Aten, the disk of the sun, whose rays ended in human hands reaching down toward the royal family. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built from scratch, Akhenaten, modern Amarna. He closed other temples. He erased the names of other gods from monuments. He replaced 3,000 years of religious tradition with a personal vision so radical that it has been called, controversially, the world's first monotheism. His wife was Nefertiti, one of history's most famous faces. When he died, everything he built was systematically dismantled. His name was erased. His city was abandoned. Memory can be thorough when it wants to be. Tutankhamun, the boy king, Akhenaten's probable son, became pharaoh at approximately 9 years old and died at 19, after a reign of about 10 years. He is the most famous pharaoh in history, despite being among the least significant politically and irony, almost entirely due to the accidental survival of his tomb. Discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, largely intact after 3,000 years, Tutankhamun's burial contained over 5,000 objects: golden shrines, alabaster jars, a solid gold death mask weighing 24 pounds, linen gloves, model boats, board games, and a dagger blade made from iron that had fallen from space, a meteorite blade in a teenage king's tomb. The universe occasionally makes irresistible gestures. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb on the 4th of November, 1922, by Howard Carter and his team funded by Lord Carnarvon, changed archaeology and popular culture simultaneously. Carter's notes from the moment he first opened the burial chamber are among the most famous in the history of science. When Carnarvon asked if he could see anything through the small hole he'd made in the sealed door, Carter reportedly replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb contained the only largely intact royal Egyptian burial ever found. Its treasures took 10 years to fully catalog and remove. The story of the Curse of the Pharaohs, a media invention following the deaths of several people connected to the discovery, has no basis in fact and has been comprehensively debunked. Lord Carnarvon, the primary target of the supposed curse, died of an infected mosquito bite. He had blood poisoning, not a curse. The Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, served as the royal burial ground for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom for approximately 500 years. At least 63 tombs and chambers have been found there, cut deep into the limestone cliffs. The decision to move from pyramids monumental and impossible to hide to hidden rock-cut tombs was a practical response to the wholesale looting of the Old Kingdom pyramids. It did not, ultimately, work much better. Almost all the Valley of the Kings tombs were robbed in antiquity, most within a few centuries of sealing. The priests eventually moved the surviving royal mummies to a cache at Deir el-Bahri for protection, where they lay undisturbed until 1871, when a family of tomb robbers discovered them and began quietly selling artifacts. The mummies of Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, and others were eventually recovered. They rest now in Cairo, still keeping each other company. Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come," was the chief wife of Akhenaten and one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. She appears in monuments not as a passive consort, but as an equal co-regent, shown performing rituals that were traditionally the exclusive domain of the pharaoh, including smiting enemies. She disappears from the official record around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, and what happened to her remains one of Egyptology's enduring mysteries. Some scholars believe she died. Others believe she became co-pharaoh under the name Neferutin. Still others believe she became the pharaoh Smenkhkare. The famous bust of her, carved around 1345 BCE, and now in the newest museum in Berlin, shows a face of extraordinary composure, a woman looking out at us with an expression that gives nothing away. Slavery in ancient Egypt was a complex institution that does not map neatly onto modern conceptions. Egypt had slaves, war captives, debt slaves, people born into servitude, but also a large class of conscripted laborers called corvée workers, who owed the state a certain amount of labor each year in lieu of taxes. The line between these categories was often blurry. What is clear is that enslaved people in Egypt could own property, marry, have legal protections, and in some cases buy their freedom. This does not make slavery acceptable. It was still a condition of enforced labor without full autonomy. But the institution was different in its structure and in its human dimensions from, say, the plantation slavery of the 18th century. History is rarely simple enough to offer clean moral categories. The ancient Egyptians wore makeup, both men and women, across all social classes. The most iconic element was kohl, a dark powder made from ground galena, lead sulfide, applied around the eyes to create the elongated, dramatic eye shape seen in virtually every Egyptian painting and sculpture. But the practice was not purely cosmetic. The dark pigment around the eyes reduced the sun's glare, functioned as an antiseptic against eye infections, and was believed to provide the protection of the god Horus. Egyptian cosmetic palettes, the flat stones on which makeup was ground and mixed, are among the oldest personal care objects found in the archaeological record, predating the first dynasties. Vanity and practicality and faith, inseparably mixed, very human. Egyptian art followed a set of formal conventions so consistent that they are recognizable across 3,000 years. Figures were depicted with the head in profile, the eye frontal, the shoulders frontal, and the hips and legs in profile again, a composite view that showed each part of the body from its most recognizable angle simultaneously. Size indicated status, not physical reality. The pharaoh was always larger than his courtiers, who were larger than the servants, who were larger than the enemies. Color was symbolic. Men were depicted with darker, reddish-brown skin, women with lighter, yellow skin. Blue represented the Nile and the sky. Green represented new growth and resurrection. These conventions were not limitations, they were a visual language, as consistent and precise as hieroglyphs, readable across millennia without a decoder. Imhotep, the Nile was not only a physical river, it was a metaphysical one. The Egyptians believed that a parallel Nile flowed through the sky, carrying the sun god's boat from east to west during the day, and through the underworld at night. The flooding of the Nile was caused, in their understanding, by the tears of the goddess Isis weeping for the slain Osiris each year, the same cosmic grief, the same divine generosity, the same gift of black soil and new life. Even the geography of Egypt was sacred. East was the land of the living, where the sun rose. West was the land of the dead, where it set. That is why virtually all Egyptian cemeteries, including the Valley of the Kings, are on the west bank of the Nile. The cardinal directions were not compass points, they were moral realities. Egyptian love poetry is among the oldest in the world and among the most surprisingly tender. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, dated to around 1300 BCE, contains a collection of love songs in which young men and women express longing, desire, jealousy, and joy with an emotional directness that crosses 5,000 years without effort. One poem has a young man describing his beloved. Her lips are like lotus buds. Her breasts are like mandrake fruits. Another has a young woman admitting she has come up with an excuse to walk past her lover's house. I will say my foot is sore, so that I must stop and rest, and then he will see me. Across all that time, the experience of being young and in love, and slightly ridiculous about it, is completely unchanged. The decline of the New Kingdom was not a single catastrophe, but a long unraveling. After Ramesses III successfully repelled the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of migrants and raiders who destabilized the entire eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, Egypt gradually weakened. The central administration fragmented. Tomb robbery became so rampant that an entire government commission was established to investigate it. High priests of Amun in Thebes accumulated so much power that they effectively controlled Upper Egypt as a separate kingdom. Foreign dynasties, Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, ruled Egypt for extended periods. The last native Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled before the Persian army in 343 BCE. Egypt would not be governed by an Egyptian again until the 20th century CE. Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, and he was welcomed almost enthusiastically as a liberator from Persian rule. He visited the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis deep in the western desert, where the priests proclaimed him the son of Amun, which, in Egyptian theological terms, made him a legitimate pharaoh. Alexander reportedly wept. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the ancient world's greatest cities, home to the famous library. He then left Egypt and never returned, dying in Babylon 9 years later at 32. His body was eventually brought back to Alexandria and entombed there, though the tomb has never been found. Somewhere under modern Alexandria, possibly under a mosque or a shopping center, the most famous conqueror in history may still be lying. The Library of Alexandria, more precisely, the Mausoleum and the Bruchion Library, was the ancient world's greatest center of scholarship, accumulated over 3 centuries by the Ptolemaic pharaohs who ruled Egypt after Alexander. At its height, it may have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, virtually every text in the Greek-speaking world, and much of what had been translated from Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond. Scholars working there included Euclid, who wrote the foundational texts of geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, Archimedes, who visited and studied there, and Hypatia, mathematician and philosopher, who was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE. The library did not burn in a single dramatic fire. It declined gradually over centuries of political instability and reduced funding. The real tragedy is not the fire. It is the slow withdrawal of attention. You've traveled far tonight, from the green Sahara before Egypt existed, to the first pyramids rising from the sand, through the empire of the pharaohs, into the strange and luminous courts of Akhenaten and Ramesses and Nefertiti, and now toward Egypt's long twilight. Take a breath. Notice your hands where they are resting, how heavy they feel. Let your body remind you that you are here, in this moment, safe and still. The history will keep moving, whether you follow every detail or not. You don't need to hold it. Let it hold you. Let's continue. The Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek-speaking Egyptian rulers who descended from one of Alexander's generals, ruled Egypt from 323 to 30 BCE. They were, in many ways, a remarkable hybrid. They ruled as Egyptian pharaohs, built Egyptian temples in the traditional style, wore Egyptian crowns, and presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects as divine in the ancient manner. But privately they spoke Greek, maintained a Greek court culture, and were far more comfortable in the Mediterranean world than the Nile Valley. The tension between these two identities runs through their entire dynasty. The most famous Ptolemy was Cleopatra VII, the last of them who was the first of her dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language. She also spoke 9 other languages, including Ethiopian, Arabic, and Hebrew. She was, in addition to everything else she was, a linguist of extraordinary range. Cleopatra VII is one of the most written about people in history, and one of the most distorted. The historical Cleopatra, as opposed to the Hollywood version, was primarily a politician and a strategist of exceptional skill. She understood that Egypt's independence depended on navigating the power of Rome, which by her time dominated the Mediterranean. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were political alliances as much as romantic ones. She needed Rome's military backing. They needed Egypt's grain and wealth. She was described by ancient sources as extraordinarily intelligent and magnetically charismatic. Plutarch, writing a century after her death, noted that her physical appearance was not so remarkable that none could be compared with her, but that the attraction of her presence, her voice, and her intellect was irresistible. She was, first and last, a mind. In 30 BCE, following the defeat of Mark Antony and the advance of Octavian's Roman forces on Alexandria, Cleopatra chose death over the humiliation of being displayed in a Roman triumph. How she died is debated. The romantic tradition says an asp, a small Egyptian cobra, whose bite she had tested on condemned prisoners. Ancient sources are uncertain. What is not uncertain is the meaning of the moment. With her death, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom and became a Roman province. 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization ended not with a conquest in battle, but with a queen's decision to die on her own terms. The last pharaoh was a Greek-speaking woman who governed by intelligence and alliance, and who chose the manner of her own ending. There is something in that which ancient Egypt itself might have recognized. Egypt, as a Roman province, was enormously important. It was the breadbasket of the empire, providing roughly 1/3 of Rome's grain supply. Roman emperors were careful never to allow a senator to visit Egypt without special permission, for fear that control of Egypt's grain could be used as political leverage. Augustus Octavian, who defeated Cleopatra, visited Egypt and stood before the mummy of Alexander the Great in Alexandria. When asked if he would also like to see the Ptolemaic pharaohs, he reportedly declined, saying he had come to see a king, not corpses. He then accidentally broke off Alexander's nose while bending to kiss the mummy's forehead. The most powerful man in the world, awkwardly damaging the body of the most famous conqueror in history. History does not always provide dignity. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1799, is a granodiorite stele inscribed with a priestly decree from 196 BCE in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics, nomadic, a later Egyptian script, and Greek. Because scholars could read Greek, they had a key to the other 2 scripts. The decipherment of hieroglyphics was completed by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in 1822, unlocking 3,000 years of Egyptian written records that had been unreadable since the ancient knowledge was lost in the 4th century CE. The Rosetta Stone is now in the British Museum. Egypt has formally requested its return multiple times. It remains in London. The politics of ancient objects in modern museums is its own long, complicated conversation. The pyramids of Giza are visible from space. They are so large that they create their own shadow patterns on satellite imagery. And yet the desert around them was not always desert in the Old Kingdom. The area around Giza was more humid. The Nile Channel flowed closer to the plateau, and boats may have been used to transport some of the building stone directly to the construction site. The Sphinx, carved from a natural limestone outcropping and believed to depict the pharaoh Khafre, shows weathering patterns that some geologists attribute to heavy rainfall, suggesting it is considerably older than the conventional dating, perhaps predating the pyramids themselves. This is a minority view in Egyptology, but the conversation about it is not yet closed. The pyramids still hold questions even after 4,000 years of being looked at. The workers who built the Sphinx left their names in the stone around it, graffiti from ancient quarry gangs, maintenance teams, and visitors stretching back millennia. One inscription from a New Kingdom scribe, visiting the Sphinx perhaps 1,000 years after it was carved, describes it with the kind of awe that modern tourists express. He came to see something ancient, something that even in his own time was already incomprehensibly old. We have been looking at the same face across thousands of years of human history, each generation finding it magnificent and mysterious and slightly beyond explanation. The Sphinx has been old for longer than most civilizations have existed. Egypt's temples were not merely spiritual buildings, they were also economic engines. A major temple like Karnak owned vast tracts of farmland, fishing rights on the Nile, workshops producing linen and pottery, and granaries that functioned as banks. The priests who administered these resources were not simply ritual specialists, they were estate managers, employers, and political powers. By the late New Kingdom, the Temple of Amun at Karnak owned approximately 1/3 of all cultivable land in Egypt. This concentration of religious and economic power contributed directly to the instability of the late New Kingdom period, as the high priests accumulated enough independent authority to challenge the pharaoh's primacy. The line between faith and economics has always been thinner than the faithful prefer to acknowledge. Ancient Egyptians had a word for the feeling of nostalgia, a longing for earlier, better times. They called it something that translates approximately as the desire for yesterday. It appears in literature going back to the Middle Kingdom. The writers of that era looked back at the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, with exactly the kind of reverent wistfulness that we look back at Egypt. We are nostalgic for a civilization that was itself nostalgic. Layers of longing, stretching back through time, each generation convinced that something essential had been lost, that the world was not what it once was. This is perhaps the most human feeling in the world, and it is very old. The Dendera zodiac, a carved stone ceiling from a chapel at the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, dated to approximately 50 BCE, is one of the most remarkable astronomical records from the ancient world. It shows the constellations in a circular map and includes representations of all 12 zodiac signs, the planets known in antiquity, and the Egyptian decan's 36 groups of stars used to tell time at night. It was removed from Egypt by French explorers in 1820 and replaced with a plaster cast. The original is now in the Louvre. The Egyptians had been observing the night sky and recording its patterns for more than 3,000 years by the time this ceiling was carved. The stars it shows are the same stars above you now. Egyptian religion survived the coming of Christianity and Islam longer than most ancient faiths. The temples at Philae, on an island in the Nile near the First Cataract, were the last functioning traditional Egyptian religious site. Priests there continued performing rituals to the goddess Isis well into the 5th century CE, centuries after Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae on August 24, 394 CE. After that, the written language that had been in continuous use for over 3,000 years fell silent. The knowledge of how to read it was lost within a generation, and then it stayed lost for 14 centuries, until Champollion and the Rosetta Stone brought it back. Languages, like people, can die and be resurrected. The Temple of Isis at Philae was eventually closed by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian around 535 CE, and the priests who served there were arrested. The sacred site was converted into a Christian church, and crosses were carved into the stone walls directly over the faces of ancient Egyptian gods. You can still see those crosses at Philae today, and you can still see the faces beneath them, the paint still faintly visible in some crevices, the eyes of Horus and Hathor and Isis looking out from behind the Christian symbols. 3,000 years of one faith, covered but not entirely erased by the next. The stone remembers what the people tried to forget. The monuments of Egypt have suffered not only from time, but from deliberate human destruction. Akhenaten erased Amun's name from monuments across Egypt. Ramesses III's successors erased her image. Christians chiseled the faces off pagan gods, Medieval lime burners reduced thousands of tons of ancient stone to plaster for building. Napoleon's troops reportedly used the Sphinx for target practice, though the missing nose predates this. Treasure hunters have looted virtually every tomb ever found. Colonial explorers shipped colossal statues to European museums. And in recent decades, some of the most significant sites have been damaged by uncontrolled tourism, urban development, rising groundwater, and in a few tragic cases, deliberate destruction. The survival of what remains is almost enduring mysteries. Some scholars believe she died. Others believe the ancient Egyptians kept many animals as pets or sacred creatures. Cats, dogs, monkeys, baboons, ducks, geese, and in at least a few documented cases, lions. Imhotep III reportedly kept a lion that is mentioned in official documents as a royal companion. Ramesses II appears to have had a pet lion named Slayer of His Foes, who reportedly accompanied him into battle. There is a painting showing a pharaoh seated on a throne with what appears to be a pet lion sitting beside him, like a very large, very regal dog. The impulse to keep large, impractical animals as status symbols, while also clearly being quite fond of them, is apparently not limited to any particular era. The obelisks of ancient Egypt, tall, four-sided tapering stone monuments with a pyramidal top, were originally created in pairs and placed at the entrances to temples, where they were believed to be conduits for solar energy, their gilded tips catching the first rays of dawn. Approximately 24 Egyptian obelisks survive today, but most of them are no longer in Egypt. One stands in Central Park in New York. Another is in London, on the embankment beside the Thames. Two are in Rome, one in Paris, one in Istanbul. The process by which they left Egypt, some as Roman trophies, others as colonial-era gifts or purchases, is a history in itself. The largest standing obelisk in the world is the Lateran obelisk in Rome, originally from Karnak, over 100 feet tall. It has been in Italy for 1600 years. The Abu Simbel temples carved directly into a sandstone cliff in Nubia under Ramesses II are among the most spectacular achievements of Egyptian engineering and the most dramatic rescue operation in archaeological history. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s, the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to permanently submerge them. In an international effort organized by UNESCO, the temples were cut into approximately 2,000 blocks, each weighing up to 30 tons, and reassembled on a cliff 65 feet higher and 200 feet back from the original site. The work took 4 years, between 1964 and 1968. The temples are oriented so that twice a year, on February 22 and October 22, believed to be the dates of Ramesses' birthday and coronation, the rising sun illuminates the statues in the inner sanctuary. After reassembly, the alignment was preserved exactly. The sun still keeps its 3,000-year appointment. The farmers of the Nile Delta today, the Fellahin, grow crops in soil that contains the sediment of 5,000 years of flooding. Their irrigation channels follow paths first dug in the time of the pharaohs. Some of their agricultural practices, their methods of managing water, their seasonal rhythms, eco practices documented in ancient papyri. Egypt is not simply a place where ancient civilization happened. It is a place where the ancient and the modern are still in conversation. The child playing beside an irrigation canal in a delta village today plays in the same landscape, fundamentally the same, changed in its particulars as the child who played there when the pyramids were being built. The Nile does not distinguish between centuries. The Sphinx at Giza was buried to its neck in sand for most of its recorded history. The sand was periodically cleared by Thutmose IV, who received a divine dream commanding him to do so, by the Romans, by Napoleon's team, by modern archaeologists. But the sand always returns. The desert is patient with stone monuments in a way that it is not patient with human things. Archaeologists working at Giza today face ongoing threats from encroaching development, from tourist traffic and its vibrations, from rising groundwater that brings salt into the limestone and cracks it from within. The monuments that have lasted 4,000 years are more vulnerable now than at almost any point in their history. We have inherited something extraordinarily fragile, disguised as something eternal. The Egyptians had a god of toilets. Hapi, a different god from the Nile deity of the same name, governed the process of elimination, and offering pits near ancient houses contained dedications to ensure its smooth functioning. More practically, ancient Egyptian homes in larger settlements were connected to drainage channels, and the wealthy had what can only be described as early toilets, limestone seats over pits or channels. The Egyptians also had dedicated toilet paper, or rather, smooth pottery shards used for cleaning, found in large quantities near latrine areas. Even in the most mundane aspects of daily existence, the Egyptians brought the same thoroughness and care that they brought to building pyramids. Dignity was not reserved for the divine. Egyptian mathematics was primarily practical, a tool for managing agriculture, construction, and taxation rather than theoretical. But within those practical limits, Egyptian mathematicians achieved remarkable things. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains 84 mathematical problems covering multiplication, fractions, geometry, and algebra. Egyptian mathematicians could calculate the area of a circle using a method that gives a value for pi of approximately 3.16, quite close to the actual value of 3.14159. They could calculate the volume of a truncated pyramid, a problem requiring considerable geometric sophistication. They used unit fractions with a numerator of 1, almost exclusively, which makes some calculations cumbersome, but their results were accurate enough to build the structures that are still standing. The Egyptians believed that at the moment of creation, the primordial mound rose out of the waters of chaos, a single hill of earth emerging from nothingness, the first solid thing in the universe. This image, the mound from the waters, is reflected in the shape of the pyramids and in the shape of the Benben stone, the sacred pointed stone that sat in the inner sanctuary of the Sun Temple at Heliopolis and was believed to be the actual first solid object, the place where the creator god first stood. Every pyramid was, in some sense, a recreation of that first moment, the act of making something solid and enduring out of chaos, of insisting on form against formlessness. The Egyptians returned to that image again and again across 3,000 years, as if the gesture of making needed to be constantly repeated, endlessly renewed. Children in ancient Egypt played with toys that would be recognizable to any child today. Archaeologists have found small wooden balls, spinning tops, dolls with articulated limbs, miniature animals on wheels, and wooden horses with real mane hair attached. There is a clay crocodile with a string attached to its jaw so that it could be pulled open and closed. A child in ancient Thebes dragging a wooden crocodile across a dirt floor in the afternoon light, delighted by the clacking jaw, is a perfectly vivid image, and it is 4,000 years old. The weight of all that antiquity becomes, at moments like this, almost too much to hold and almost too sweet to put down. Ancient Egypt was a society with profound inequalities built into its foundations. The pharaoh and his court occupied a position of absolute power and unimaginable wealth. Beneath them was a small administrative elite, the scribes, the priests, the military commanders, who lived in comfort but served at royal pleasure. Below them were the artisans and skilled craftsmen, who lived modestly but had security in their specialized labor. At the base were the farmers and laborers, who produced the food and did the physical work, living lives of hard labor with few resources and little protection against famine, disease, or the demands of the state. This is not unique to Egypt, it is the template of almost every ancient civilization, but it is worth naming, so that the monuments do not eclipse the people who built them at the greatest cost. Graffiti is as old as civilization. The workers who built the Great Pyramid left graffiti in the blocks, gang names and work gang symbols, painted in red ochre on the stones before they were laid, now preserved in the interior passages. Later visitors to the ancient monuments also left their marks. Greek and Roman tourists carved their names into Egyptian temple walls with enthusiasm, More than 2,000 Greek and Latin inscriptions survive at Abu Simbel alone. One inscription at Karnak, written in Greek, reads, "I, Hadnon of Ephesus, came to see Memnon, and having seen and admired it, I departed with delight." The impulse to write, "I was here," on something ancient and impressive is apparently not a product of modern disrespect. It is among the most human of impulses. The Egyptians would have understood it. The climate of Egypt essentially rainless, with extremely low humidity is the primary reason so many organic materials have survived. Papyrus scrolls, linen wrappings, wooden furniture, leather sandals, woven baskets, flower garlands placed in tombs. 3,000 years ago, all of these have survived in Egyptian tombs because the dry desert air inhibits the decomposition processes that would destroy them elsewhere. The flowers found in Tutankhamun's tomb placed there in 1323 BCE could be botanically identified. Bread found in Old Kingdom tombs has been analyzed for its yeast content. Hair from mummies has been tested for diet, disease, and stress patterns. Egypt's climate is, inadvertently, the world's greatest archive of ancient organic material. The desert that limited Egypt also preserved it. The flooding of the Nile ended in the 20th century. The construction of the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, permanently regulated the river's flow and ended the annual inundation that had shaped Egyptian civilization for 10,000 years. The black silt no longer spreads across the farmland. The fields are fertilized now with chemical fertilizers instead. Lake Nasser, created by the dam, submerged dozens of ancient sites. The delta is slowly sinking, partly because the silt that once replenished it no longer reaches the sea. The relationship between Egypt and the Nile that created one of the greatest civilizations in history ended, quietly, within living memory. Something that had defined a people for longer than writing had existed was altered forever within a single generation. This is what it is to live in the modern world. Ancient arrangements dissolve at a speed that history has never seen before. The sound of ancient Egyptian music is largely lost. Instruments survive, but the notation does not. We know they had harps, lutes, lyres, flutes, oboes, clappers, sistrums, a kind of sacred rattle, and drums. We know music was central to religious ritual, to royal ceremonies, to feast days and funerals. We know there were professional musicians, and that music was considered a skilled and respected craft. But the actual melodies, what a harpist played in the temple of Hathor at night while the priests completed their ritual, what a singer sang at a feast in Ramesses' court, those sounds have dissolved completely into silence. Music is the most perishable of arts. The flute survives. The song does not. The ancient Egyptians feared death and prepared obsessively for it. But their literature also shows people who loved life with a fullness that the preparations for death do not contradict. The Harper's Song, a poem found in several New Kingdom tombs, gives voice to a radical sentiment that sits uneasily alongside all those elaborate preparations for the afterlife. Make holiday, and weary not therein. Behold, it is not given to man to take his goods with him. Behold, there is no one who departed, who has come back again. The poem urges the reader to enjoy life, eat, drink, be with those they love, because no one knows what comes after. This voice, skeptical, pleasure-affirming, quietly doubtful, was carved into the walls of tombs. It was placed beside the coffins of the dead. Egypt contained its own dissenters. The ancient Egyptian word for cat was miu, which is directly onomatopoeic. They named the cat after the sound it makes. This is linguistically charming, but it also tells us something. The Egyptians were listening carefully to the world around them, a civilization that named the cat for its voice, that built a writing system from careful observation of birds and insects and human postures, that oriented their entire spiritual life around the patterns of sky and river and desert. These are people who paid attention. Their monuments last because they were made with obsessive care. Their art endures because it was made with precise observation. That habit of attention, maintained across 3,000 years, is perhaps the deepest thing they left us. Papyrus, the writing material that gave us the word paper, was made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly in the Nile Delta marshes. The pith was cut into thin strips, laid in overlapping layers at right angles, pressed, dried, and polished with a smooth stone to create a writing surface. A single sheet of papyrus might be joined with others into a scroll that could be many feet long. The production of papyrus was an Egyptian monopoly for thousands of years. It was exported across the ancient world and was the primary writing material of Greece, Rome, and the early Christian Church. When the papyrus marshes of the Nile Delta declined partly from drainage for agriculture, it contributed to the shift toward parchment, animal skin, as the dominant writing material of the medieval world. A plant's ecology shaped the intellectual history of Western civilization. The last complete Egyptian temple complex, built in the traditional pharaonic style, is Edfu, the Temple of Horus, in Upper Egypt, completed around 57 BCE under the Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy XII. It is also the best preserved ancient Egyptian temple in the world, its walls still standing nearly to their original height, its inner sanctuaries intact, its relief still carrying traces of color. Standing inside Edfu is as close as it is possible to come to experiencing an Egyptian temple as it would have appeared in use. The scale, the darkness, the quality of light filtered through high-slit windows, the smell of ancient stone. The last hieroglyph was carved a generation after this temple was completed. Then the knowledge of how to write was lost. Then 1400 years passed. Then Champollion. Then us. Consider what it means that ancient Egypt is still with us. The word chemistry may derive from chem, the black land, Egypt through the Greek chemia, referring to Egyptian metallurgical and medical knowledge. The 12-month, 365-day calendar we use is descended from the Egyptian civil calendar. The concept of the week, the hours of the day, and the division of the night sky into constellations we still recognize were all formalized in Egypt. When you look at the night sky and see Orion, you are seeing what the Egyptians called Sahu, the soul of Osiris. The civilization that began when rain-seeking nomads followed the water to the Nile Valley is still present in the language we use, the time we keep, and the stars we call by name. Egypt was never conquered by time, it was absorbed by it. The culture that the Arabs encountered when they arrived in 641 CE was already a shadow, Christian in religion, Greek in administrative language, Roman in law, but still speaking Coptic, a direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, written in a modified Greek alphabet. The Arabic that replaced it is what Egyptians speak today. The Coptic language survives only in the liturgy of the Coptic Christian Church, a living language used only in prayer, spoken by perhaps 10 million people, descended directly from the language of the Pharaohs. The last living descendants of ancient Egyptian speech are the priests chanting in Coptic churches in modern Cairo. The thread runs unbroken, thinner now, but unbroken. Howard Carter, who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, kept a detailed daily diary of the excavation. In it, alongside meticulous archaeological notes, he records his personal reactions, his awe, his exhaustion, his frustration with the press and with the crowds of officials and aristocrats who kept interrupting the work to take photographs. One entry notes that he found a small painted wooden chest near the entrance of the tomb and opened it to find a pair of the young king's sandals, perfectly preserved, and beside them, his gloves. Something about the sandals stopped him. He wrote about them at length, the size of them, their delicacy, the traces of use. A dead teenage boy's sandals, 3,000 years old, perfectly preserved in the dark. Carter, who had dedicated his life to archaeology, was not prepared for how much that would affect him. The Great Sphinx of Giza is carved from a single ridge of limestone bedrock that was left in place after the quarrying of stone for the Khafre pyramid. It is 240 feet long, 66 feet tall, and 62 feet wide at the broadest point. Its face, traditionally attributed to the pharaoh Khafre, though this is debated, was once painted red, its headdress striped in yellow and blue. Between its paws once stood a granite stele, recording the dream of Thutmose IV, who claimed the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and promised him the kingship if he would clear away the sand burying its body. Thutmose did so, became pharaoh, and had the dream recorded in stone. The Sphinx has been asking for its body to be uncovered for 4,000 years. We keep uncovering it, and the sand keeps coming back. There are pyramids in Sudan that most people do not know exist. The kingdom of Kush, the Nubian civilization that traded with, fought against, and occasionally ruled Egypt, built more pyramids than Egypt itself. The Kushite pyramids, clustered at sites like Meroe and Nuri and El Kuru, are steeper and narrower than the Egyptian ones, built across a 1,000-year period beginning around 700 BCE. They were largely unknown to the modern world until the 19th century. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty Kushite rulers, who conquered and ruled all of Egypt from around 747 to 656 BCE, built pyramids for themselves at El Kuru in the Sudanese desert. The tradition of pyramid building, born on the banks of the Nile, spread south and lasted longer and went further than most histories remember. Among the most moving objects to survive from ancient Egypt are the execration texts, lists of enemies, written on pottery or figurines that were then smashed or buried to symbolically destroy the people named. The enemies listed are foreign rulers, rebellious officials, dangerous animals, but also, painfully, internal fears. Some execration texts list by name the enemies within the writer's own community, those who harbor grudges, those who wish harm, those who practice malice. Here is a person in ancient Egypt, pressing their fears and their enemies into clay and then crushing it underfoot, performing the magical act of control over what frightened them. The psychology is completely legible. The need to externalize fear, to make it physical, to destroy its representation, this is not ancient. This is simply human. The ancient Egyptians sometimes mummified animals as religious offerings, crocodiles sacred to Sobek, cats sacred to Bastet, ibises sacred to Thoth, hawks sacred to Horus. At some sites, millions of animal mummies were deposited. Recent analysis has revealed that a significant percentage of these animal mummies contain no animal at all, or contain only partial remains, perhaps feathers or bones. Scholars have suggested this represents a kind of ancient religious fraud. Priests selling empty mummy-shaped bundles as sacred offerings to pilgrims who could not check the contents. The ancient world was not innocent of exploitation. The desire to profit from other people's faith is as old as faith itself. There is a painting in the Theban tomb of Nebamun, dated to around 1350 BCE, that shows a banquet scene. Guests are dressed in fine white linen, wearing cones of scented fat on their heads that would melt slowly through the evening, releasing fragrance. Musicians play, servants pour wine. Two women in the foreground are dancing, their bodies caught in a moment of movement, their robes swirling. They look alive, they look joyful, they look like people at a party that is going well. This painting is 3,400 years old, and the pleasure it depicts is completely recognizable. The women dancing in Nebamun's tomb are dancing still, in their pigment and their limestone, in a gallery in the British Museum, to music that ended 3.5 millennia ago. The process of writing in ancient Egypt required a brush made from a reed plant, ink made from carbon black or red ochre mixed with gum and water, and a palette with 2 wells, one for each color. Scribes practiced for years before they were trusted with final documents. Papyrus was expensive enough that practice work was done on ostraca pottery shards, or flat limestone chips that were used and then discarded. Thousands of ostraca from the artisans' village of Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, survive, containing practice texts, letters, accounts, legal documents, love poetry, and shopping lists. One ostracon contains what appears to be a sketch of a pharaoh, drawn with a freedom and irreverence that official monuments never permitted. An artist's private joke, 3,000 years old, preserved in the Luxor Museum. Consider what 3,000 years of continuous civilization means in human terms. If you took a person alive today and walked them back 30 years, they would reach 1,000, 996. Back another 30, and they would be in 1966. Back another 30, 1936. The world of Hitler and Stalin and the Great Depression. 30 more, 1906. 30 more, the 1870s. 30 more, the American Civil War era. Keep going 10 more generations back, and you reach the birth of Christ. Go back 30 more generations, and you are at the beginning of ancient Egypt. Each of those generations was as vivid and full and complicated as yours. Each contained people who fell in love, buried their parents, worried about their children, wondered what came next. 3,000 years is not a period. It is a succession of individual human lives, end to end, stretching back further than the mind easily goes. In the village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes, lived the craftsmen and artists who built and decorated the royal tombs of the New Kingdom. They were an elite community, literate, skilled, well provided for by the state, and they left behind the richest documentary record of daily life in ancient Egypt. Their letters, their legal disputes, their work records, their love poems, their complaints about late rations, their requests to take sick days, their wills, all of this survives. One of the world's oldest recorded labor strikes happened here, around 1170 BCE, when the workers stopped work and sat down outside their compound, refusing to continue until their overdue rations were delivered. They were the craftsmen who painted the afterlife. They demanded bread in this life first. The afterlife that the Egyptians prepared so elaborately for was not guaranteed. The spells and rituals and mummies and offerings were insurance against non-existence, not tickets to paradise. The weighing of the heart could go wrong, the spells could fail, the mummy could be destroyed, and beyond those risks, there was the simpler risk that was almost impossible to prevent, the erasure of the deceased's name. For the Egyptians, the name was a core component of the soul. Without it, a person could not persist. To erase someone's name from monuments, as Akhenaten's successors did to him, was a form of second death, an attempt to unmake them from existence. Say my name was not merely a phrase. It was a claim on survival. This is why we still speak the names of the pharaohs. We are doing something the Egyptians would have recognized as an act of maintenance, of care. The Egyptian word for scribe can also be translated as painter, and the line between the two was deliberately blurred. Text and image were not considered separate arts, they were aspects of the same activity, making visible what was true. Hieroglyphs were not just written, they were drawn, each sign a small picture rendered with care. When a wall was being prepared for inscription, the most senior scribes did the text, and the most senior artists did the figures. But both were working in the same visual tradition, with the same materials, toward the same goal. The idea that words and images are in competition with each other, that they are different and lesser versions of the same impulse, would have been foreign to Egyptian thought. For them, they were the same thing. The weighing of the heart ceremony, the final judgment of the dead, was attended, according to Egyptian belief, by 42 divine judges, each responsible for a different region of Egypt and a different category of sin. The god Anubis, jackal-headed, the guardian of the dead, conducted the weighing itself. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, recorded the verdict, and Ammit, the devourer, the crocodile-lion-hippo composite, waited beside the scales. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the deceased was declared true of voice, a phrase the Egyptians used as a kind of posthumous honorific, added after a dead person's name the way we might say, rest in peace. The whole ceremony was depicted in the Book of the Dead, which was not a book in the modern sense, but a collection of spells and instructions compiled specifically for the individual who purchased it. The Abu Simbel temples that Ramesses II carved from the Nubian cliff face were designed to perform a specific astronomical function. Twice a year, the rising sun would penetrate the full length of the temple corridor, 180 feet of darkness, and illuminate the 4 statues in the innermost sanctuary. 3 of those statues, Ramesses himself, Amun-Ra, and Ra-Horakhti were meant to receive the light. The fourth statue, Ptah, god of the underworld, was designed to remain permanently in shadow. This required extraordinary precision in the orientation of the entire structure, planned and executed without instruments we would consider adequate for such accuracy. The sun still illuminates the right statues on the right days. The precision of that intention, maintained across 3,000 years, is difficult to entirely comprehend. The last thing we know about Cleopatra VII, before she died, is that she asked to be buried beside Mark Antony. Her request was denied. Octavian needed to prevent her tomb from becoming a rallying point. Her body was buried somewhere in Alexandria, the city she had ruled and loved. The location of her tomb has never been found. Somewhere under modern Alexandria, a city of 5 million people, built on top of the ancient one, Cleopatra lies in a location that may never be excavated, in a tomb that may no longer exist. The last pharaoh, the last of 3,000 years of Egyptian sovereignty, rests in an undiscovered place beneath a city that has forgotten where she is. History has a way of making even the greatest people small, in the end as small as a 3-inch ivory figurine, as small as a pair of sandals in a painted chest. The great irony of ancient Egypt is that the civilization that was most obsessed with permanence is now most defined by what has been lost. The music is gone. The private conversations are gone. The texture of ordinary days, the sound of a market in Memphis, the smell of bread baking in a Theban street, the laughter in a courtyard at night, all of this is gone beyond recovery. What survives are the things made to survive: the stone, the painted wall, the buried papyrus. Egypt built for eternity, and in building for eternity, it sacrificed the ephemeral. We know enormous amounts about what the Egyptians believed about death, and very little about what they said to each other on ordinary evenings. The monument is not the civilization. The civilization was everything else. Archaeologists working at Amarna, the city Akhenaten built and abandoned, found a neighborhood that appears to have been occupied by workmen during construction, later reoccupied by ordinary families after the city was reopened following Akhenaten's death. In the debris of these houses, they found toys, hairpins, broken cooking pots, game pieces, a child's sandal, fish bones from dinner, seeds of vegetables grown in the garden. The rubbish of ordinary life, preserved in the desert. One of the small finds was a tiny model of a hedgehog, made from clay. It sits in a museum case. It is perhaps 3 inches long, roughly formed, clearly made by someone who knew hedgehogs and found them endearing enough to render in clay. 3,400 years later, it is difficult not to feel exactly the same way. Ancient Egypt's contribution to human civilization runs deep and wide. Its calendar gave us our year. Its geometry gave us the tools to measure the earth. Its medical texts established the clinical observation of the body. Its concept of the divine king, the ruler, as sacred intermediary between the human and divine, influenced the political theology of civilizations from ancient Israel to medieval Europe. Its art conventions, absorbed through Greece and Rome, echo still in Western visual culture. Its religious imagery, the eye, the ankh, the pyramid, are among the most recognized symbols on Earth. The civilization that ended in 30 BCE is not simply historical, it is structural. It is in the foundations of things. Without Egypt, the world as we know it does not have the same shape. The river that made Egypt possible has one of the strangest geographical paradoxes in the world. It flows through the Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth, without a single tributary joining it for nearly 2,000 miles. From Khartoum in modern Sudan to Cairo, no other river feeds the Nile. It sustains itself on the snowmelt and rainfall of the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, carrying that water across a continent of sand, arriving at the Mediterranean with enough volume to push its plume of freshwater miles into the sea. When ancient sailors approached Egypt from the Mediterranean, they could detect the river's presence before they could see the shore, a faint darkening of the water, a change in smell, the first pale hint of life in the immensity of sea. Egypt announced itself. It always has. The workmen's village of Deir el Medina was home, at its peak, to perhaps 120 families, the artists and craftsmen and their households, who spent generation after generation building and decorating royal tombs. Sons followed fathers into the trade, daughters married within the community. The village was walled, watched over by guards, and largely separate from the rest of Egyptian society. The people inside knew secrets, the locations and contents of royal tombs that the state preferred to contain. They were well compensated. Their rations included bread, beer, fish, vegetables, oil, and occasionally luxury goods. But they were also, in a meaningful sense, imprisoned by their own specialization. The knowledge that made them valuable also made them permanent residents of a village most of them never left. The relationship between ancient Egypt and the people it conquered, particularly the Nubians to the south, was one of the ancient world's most complex dynamics. Egypt exploited Nubian gold mines, conscripted Nubian soldiers, and at various points treated Nubian populations as subject peoples enslaved, taxed, forcibly resettled. And yet Nubian culture was never simply erased. Nubian rulers adopted Egyptian religious practices with genuine devotion, built Egyptian-style temples, wrote in hieroglyphs, and buried their kings in pyramids. When the Nubian 25th dynasty conquered Egypt around 747 BCE, their pharaohs were perhaps the most Egyptian of any rulers in the late period, revering the old traditions, restoring neglected temples, ruling with a legitimacy grounded in deep engagement with Egyptian culture. The conquered had been watching carefully. They learned what mattered. The ancient Egyptians invented the concept of the wig. Wigs, made from human hair, plant fibers, or wool, were widely worn by both men and women across all social classes, practical in a climate where shaving the head prevented lice and heat, but where a full head of hair was considered beautiful and appropriate for formal occasions. The wig industry was substantial enough to warrant professional wig makers. Elite wigs were elaborate constructions of human hair woven onto a base of vegetable fiber, treated with beeswax, scented with oils, and sometimes decorated with gold or faience beads. A very fine wig found in a New Kingdom burial was still soft and flexible after 3,000 years. The craft that went into it, the patience, the skill, is immediately evident even in a museum case. Some vanities are worth the effort. The ancient Egyptians were the first known people to use contraception. Medical papyri from around 1850 BCE describe methods of preventing pregnancy that include pessaries made from a mixture of crocodile dung, honey, and natron. While this sounds alarming, the acidic nature of crocodile dung would indeed function as a spermicide. Other methods listed include a suppository of acacia gum, and modern science has confirmed that acacia ferments into lactic acid, a genuine contraceptive. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus also describe remedies for unwanted pregnancies. The Egyptians had an intimate and practical relationship with the biology of reproduction that later civilizations, under the influence of different religious frameworks, often refused to articulate as openly. The practical knowledge was ancient. The willingness to write it down was, in some respects, modern. The ancient Egyptians understood that the universe was old. Their cosmological texts describe periods of time so vast that they used the word he, meaning millions or even infinity, to describe them. The creator god Atum, in one text, describes the time before creation as an endless dark ocean of nothingness, and projects a time after existence when everything will dissolve back into it, when even the gods will die, and only Atum and Osiris will remain, coiled together in the dark. This is not a young universe theology. This is a theology comfortable with incomprehensible timescales, with the idea that the world as we know it is a brief, luminous interruption in an otherwise unthinkable darkness. The Egyptians looked at the night sky and understood, in their own way, that they were small. They built their pyramids anyway. Egyptian funerary literature includes some of the most tender passages in the ancient world. The lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, spells recited over the deceased during the funeral ritual, as two goddesses speaking in the voice of women, grieving a beloved brother and husband, calling him back from the dead with language that is raw and domestic and heartbreaking in equal measure. "Come to your house," Isis cries. "Come to your house. Your sister calls you. Come to her who loves you." These words were recited over real bodies, by real people, in the formal ritual context of ancient funerals. Whatever the theology, the emotion behind the words is not symbolic. Grief that deep is not performed. It is endured. The Temple of Medinet Habu at Thebes contains the most detailed account of the Battle of the Delta, Egypt's victory over the Sea Peoples under Ramesses III, around 1175 BCE. The inscriptions show Egyptian forces fighting from ships and from shore, attacking a coalition of migrants and raiders whose origins are still debated. What the inscriptions also reveal, between the lines of official triumph, is how close it came to catastrophe. Egypt survived this onslaught barely. The Sea Peoples destroyed or disrupted every other major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the kingdoms of Cyprus and the Levantine coast. Egypt endured. But the energy required to survive changed it permanently. The new kingdom never fully recovered its earlier vitality. The victory at the Delta was Egypt's last great military moment. Ancient Egyptians played a game that historians call Mehen, after the serpent god of the same name, in which pieces moved along a coiled spiral board, resembling a snake curled from head to tail. The rules are not entirely understood, but the game was popular in the Old Kingdom and involved multiple players and perhaps some element of chance with throw sticks or dice. What makes Mehen remarkable is its symbolic dimension. The serpent, Mehen, was one of the protective gods of the solar boat, coiling around Ra as he passed through the underworld at night. Playing the game moving across the coiled body of the protective serpent may have had a ritual or magical significance beyond entertainment. The Egyptians had a gift for making the sacred playful and the playful sacred. These were not separate categories. The ancient Egyptian economy operated largely without coined money until the Ptolemaic period. Exchange was conducted through a system of barter and a unit of account called the deben, originally a weight of copper, about 91 grams, later of silver or gold. Prices were expressed in debens, but actual payment might be made in grain, linen, bronze, or any commodity agreed upon by the parties. A standard carpenter's chair was worth 1 deben of copper. A coffin might cost 2.5 debens of silver. A cow was 4 debens of silver. Tax was paid in grain and labor. Workers received rations rather than wages. This system functioned for 3,000 years without ever requiring a mint. The introduction of coinage by the Ptolemies was, for most ordinary Egyptians, a radical and disorienting change to the only economic logic they had ever known. The word pharaoh entered the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, from the Egyptian, and through the Bible it entered virtually every subsequent Western language. The story of Moses and the Exodus, whatever its historical basis, was shaped by Egyptian reality. The description of the palace, the court, the process of royal decision-making, the relationship between the state and foreign peoples. All of this reflects an intimate knowledge of Egyptian life. Whether or not the Exodus happened as described, the people who told that story knew Egypt from the inside. Egypt shaped the foundational narrative of Judaism, which shaped the foundational narratives of Christianity and Islam. The civilization that ended in 30 BCE is present in the 3 great Abrahamic religions. Its shadow falls across half of humanity's spiritual life. Among the most personal documents to survive from ancient Egypt are a collection of letters to the dead, texts written by the living and left at the tombs of recently deceased relatives, asking them to intervene in worldly disputes from the other side. One letter, written on a pottery bowl left at a husband's tomb, is from a widow accusing her dead mother-in-law of causing illness in the family from beyond the grave and asking her dead husband to intercede. The tone is aggrieved, specific, and completely recognizable as the voice of a person at the end of their patience dealing with a difficult family member who happens to be dead. The Egyptian dead were not simply mourned, they were expected to remain involved in family affairs. Death was not a severance, it was a change of address. The ancient practice of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the erasure of a person from official record, was practiced by the Egyptians with particular thoroughness. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III had her image hacked out of temple walls, her cartouches overwritten with his own name or those of his predecessors, her monuments dismantled. After Akhenaten's death, the same fate was visited on him on a larger scale. The motives are debated: political, theological, personal, but the effect was the same: an attempt to make someone as if they had never been. That it never entirely worked, that Hatshepsut and Akhenaten are among the most famous names in ancient history, is history's small revenge on those who would unmake the past. You cannot unsay a name that has already been heard. The ancient Egyptians had a strong preference for symmetry in their art, their architecture, and their spiritual understanding of the world. This manifested in some unexpected places. The temples at Karnak and Luxor were linked by an avenue of sphinxes, stretching nearly 2 miles, lined with hundreds of ram-headed sphinx statues, one matching the other across the entire length. When a pharaoh added a pair of obelisks to a temple entrance, they had to be as closely matched in height and quality as the quarries could manage. This love of symmetry was not purely aesthetic. It reflected the theological concept of duality, the world as balanced pairs, Upper and Lower Egypt, the living and the dead, Horus and Set, the Black Land and the Red Land. The universe was, in Egyptian thought, a problem of balance. They built their symmetry in stone to remind themselves. The Egyptians developed one of the ancient world's most sophisticated systems of water management. The nilometer, a calibrated pillar or stairway set into the riverbed, used to measure the height of the annual flood, provided critical data for predicting the agricultural year and calculating tax rates. The first known nilometer is at Elephantine Island near Aswan, and nilometers were maintained there and at other sites continuously from at least the Old Kingdom until the modern era. The readings taken at nilometers each year were transmitted by courier to the capital, where administrators used them to calculate expected grain yields and adjust tax assessments accordingly. The taxation system of the world's first large-scale bureaucratic state depended, ultimately, on a person standing at a carved stone column in the Nile, watching the water level rise. In the innermost sanctuary of the Temple of Luxor, built by Imhotep III and expanded by Ramesses II, there is a room that later Roman soldiers converted into a shrine for the imperial cult by painting over the Egyptian reliefs. The Roman paintings have largely faded, and beneath them, the original Egyptian decoration has begun to reappear. Amun-Ra, the king, the ritual figures, faintly visible again after 1700 years under Roman plaster. The Egyptian images are older, and they are coming back. There is something almost too resonant about that image. The ancient returning, the later edition fading, the original showing through. Egypt has a way of outlasting the things that tried to cover it. The artist who painted the banquet scene in Nebamun's tomb, the one with the dancing women, the musicians, the scented evening left no name. Egyptian artists were almost never credited individually. The work was collective, and the glory went to the patron. But the quality of that painting suggests a person of extraordinary skill who spent years developing a particular way of seeing movement, of capturing the curve of a bent elbow, the tilt of a head. Somewhere in ancient Thebes, around 1350 BCE, a man or a woman with a reed brush was solving, in real time, the problem of how to make paint move. They succeeded entirely. Their name is lost. Their solution to that problem has been in a museum for 150 years. The work outlives the worker always. Sometimes, as here, it outlives everything. The Fayum mummy portraits painted on wooden panels and placed over the faces of mummies in Roman-era Egypt between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE represent one of the strangest and most beautiful intersections in ancient art: Greek-Roman portrait painting combined with Egyptian funerary practice. The portraits show real people: a young woman in gold jewelry, a middle-aged man with a beard, a child with wide eyes painted with an emotional directness and a command of light and shadow that is startling. They look like photographs, They look alive. They were painted for the dead. They gaze out of museum walls now with an expression that is not grief and not joy, something in between, something that resembles awareness. Of all the faces that have come to us from ancient Egypt, these are the ones that look most directly back. Egypt exported its architecture across the ancient world, and the ancient world was delighted to receive it. The Romans built Egyptian-style temples in Rome itself. The city of Pompeii had an Isis temple that attracted a large congregation. The cult of Isis spread across the entire Roman Empire, from Britain to Mesopotamia, finding followers among people who had never seen the Nile. There were Isis temples in London, in Paris, in Cologne, in what is now Afghanistan. The Romans even invented an Egyptian architectural style, a genre of wall painting called Egyptomania, that depicted Nilotic scenes, sacred ibises, crocodiles, lotus flowers, a fantasy Egypt for Roman interiors. The first outbreak of Egyptian style in Western culture was Roman. Our own post-Napoleon Egyptomania in the 19th century. The Cleopatra films of Hollywood, the pyramid on the American dollar, all descendants of that Roman infatuation. The canopic jars that held the preserved internal organs of the mummified dead were protected by the four sons of Horus, each associated with a specific organ and a specific cardinal direction. Imhotep, human-headed, facing south, protected the liver. Happy, baboon-headed, facing north, protected the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, facing east, protected the stomach. Kibesnuef, falcon-headed, facing west, protected the intestines. The lids of the canopic jars bore the face of the relevant deity, and the jars themselves were often placed inside a canopic chest that was further decorated with protective imagery. From the New Kingdom onward, the organs were actually wrapped and returned to the mummy's body cavity rather than stored in separate jars. But the jars remained in the tomb as an extra layer of symbolic protection. The Egyptians believed in redundancy. When eternity is at stake, one precaution is never enough. The concept of the Ba and the Ka, two of the 5 components of the Egyptian soul, defies easy translation. The Ka was something like the life force, the animating energy, the double that was born with each person and survived death, needing continued nourishment through food offerings at the tomb. The Ba was something like the personality, the individual character, depicted as a human-headed bird that could fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. After death, the Ba and Ka needed to be reunited in the mummified body each night for the deceased to rest. During the day, the Ba could travel, visit the places it had loved, experience the world in a transformed way. The ancient Egyptians believed that the dead were not simply absent, they were nearby, mobile, active, hungry. They needed the living to remember them. They needed bread. Among the most remarkable finds from the Deir el-Medina archive is a series of court records from the workmen's community, a village court that heard disputes between neighbors, settled inheritance arguments, and adjudicated property claims. These records read with a vividness that is almost novelistic. One case concerns a woman who lent her neighbor a pot and did not get it back. Another involves a dispute over a donkey. A third is a contested will. The people in these documents have names and personalities and grievances that are completely legible 3,000 years later. They are arguing about the same things people argue about today: money, property, family, fairness. The law courts of Deir el-Medina are a reminder that ordinary life has a texture that the grand historical narrative rarely captures, and that the texture of ordinary life has barely changed. The ancient Egyptians kept records of famine with the same meticulous care they brought to everything else. The famine stele on the island of Khnum near Aswan, inscribed in the Ptolemaic period but claiming to record events from the Old Kingdom reign of Djoser, describes 7 years of failed Nile floods and the starvation that followed. Grain was scarce, kernels were dried up. Scarce was every kind of food. The text describes people fighting each other for food, children crying, the old sitting with bent knees. Whatever its historical accuracy, the text preserves the memory of what low Nile years meant to the people who lived through them, the specific texture of collective hunger. the particular despair of watching the river that fed you fail. Egypt's abundance was conditional. They knew it. They wrote it down. Ancient Egyptian physicians had a treatment for migraines that involved applying a clay crocodile holding a grain of wheat in its clay mouth to the patient's head while reciting spells. The logic was simultaneously physical and magical. The hardness and weight of the clay, the symbolism of the crocodile, the power of the spoken word, all working together toward the same end. This may sound absurd, but the combination of a physical intervention, a distracting focus, the crocodile on the head, and the reassurance of a spoken ritual administered by a trusted authority figure is not entirely different from some elements of modern therapeutic practice. The Egyptians blended medicine and magic so thoroughly that the two could not be separated. Perhaps they understood something we are only beginning to articulate, that healing is never purely physical and never purely psychological, but always both at once. The ancient Egyptian measurement system was based on the human body. The basic unit was the digit, approximately the width of a finger, about 18.75 millimeters. 4 digits made a palm. 7 palms made a royal cubit, approximately 52.3 centimeters, or about 20.6 inches. And this was the master unit used in all large-scale construction, including the pyramids. The cubit rods used by master builders were ceremonially important objects, sometimes made of stone and inscribed with the name of the pharaoh. Accuracy was critical. All cubit rods in use on a major construction project were periodically checked against a master standard kept at the palace or temple. The Great Pyramid's base, measured in royal cubits, is 440 cubits on each side, with an accuracy of less than 0.05%. The human body, extended through careful standardization, built wonders. There are currently over 130 known ancient Egyptian pyramids. The most famous are at Giza, but pyramids were built across Egypt and Sudan over a period of approximately 3,000 years. The earliest true pyramid, the first with smooth sides rather than steps, was the Medum Pyramid, built around 2600 BCE by either Sneferu or his father Huni. It partially collapsed in antiquity, and the rubble pile around it is visible today as a dramatic ruin. Sneferu then built 2 more pyramids at Dashur, the Bent Pyramid, whose angle changes midway up, suggesting a structural problem was discovered in mid-construction, and the Red Pyramid, the world's first successful true pyramid. In one reign, one pharaoh built 3 pyramids, including the failed experiment, and developed through trial and error the form that his son Khufu would bring to its perfect expression at Giza. The scribe Ani, who lived during the 19th dynasty around 1250 BCE, is known to us because a copy of the Book of the Dead made for him, called the Papyrus of Ani, survived and is now in the British Museum. It is among the most beautiful, illuminated manuscripts in existence, its illustrations painted with extraordinary skill and care. Ani is depicted in numerous vignettes, worshipping the gods, playing senet with his wife, making offerings, standing at the scales of judgment. He appears as a small, carefully drawn figure, wearing white robes, with an expression of composed attention. He worked in the royal granaries. He was a government accountant. He commissioned this document at considerable expense to ensure his safe passage through the afterlife. He wanted to endure. Here he is, 3,000 years later, still carefully painted, still composed, still present in a glass case in London. He made it. The ancient world's most famous unsolved disappearance may be the Ark of the Covenant, and Egypt is woven into its story. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Ark was brought out of Egypt during the Exodus and eventually housed in Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. After the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Ark's fate becomes a mystery. Some traditions hold that it was taken to Ethiopia by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Others believe it was hidden before the Babylonian siege. The Ethiopian city of Aksum claims to possess it today, in a chapel that no one outside the guardian priesthood is permitted to enter or verify. What is certain is that the Ark has been missing for 2,600 years, and that its disappearance has generated more speculation than perhaps any other missing object in human history. Egypt is always somewhere in these old mysteries. Ancient Egyptians dyed their hair. The use of henna, a plant-derived reddish-brown dye on hair, is documented in ancient Egypt going back to at least 1500 BCE. Elderly mummies have been found with hennaed hair, suggesting it was used to cover gray and maintain the appearance of youth. The mummy of Ramesses II himself has reddish hair, and chemical analysis has confirmed this was achieved with henna. One of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world, conqueror of Nubia, builder of Abu Simbel, the pharaoh who stared down the Hittites and made them blink, was touching up his gray roots. There is something so completely and recognizably human about this that it is almost difficult to absorb. Vanity, apparently, does not diminish in proportion to one's achievements. Egyptian tomb paintings have survived for millennia because of a combination of factors: the dry, stable climate, the mineral-based pigments that do not fade in darkness, the smooth, carefully prepared plaster surfaces they were painted on, and the sealed conditions that prevented the oxidation and biological processes that degrade organic materials. The pigments used included carbon black from soot, white from gypsum or calcite, red and yellow from iron oxides, green from malachite or a synthetic frit, blue from a synthetic copper-calcium silicate glass called Egyptian blue, the world's first synthetic pigment, created specifically for artists who needed a stable, non-fading blue in a country where naturally blue minerals were rare. Egyptian blue, once thought to be a mystery, was rediscovered by modern scientists and is now studied for its unusual optical properties. It fluoresces in near-infrared light. The color made to last has lasted, and it still surprises the instruments we use to look at it. As Egypt's power declined in the first millennium BCE, a remarkable thing happened. The Egyptians began writing their history more deliberately, codifying what they were and had been, as if aware that the Great Age was passing. The priests composed king lists that reached back to the earliest dynasties. Scribes copied older texts with special care. The temples built in this period, the Ptolemaic temples at Edfu, Dendera, Esna, Qom, Ombo, are extraordinarily detailed repositories of religious knowledge. Their walls covered floor to ceiling with text that seemed designed to record everything before it was too late. It is as if the civilization, sensing its own twilight, tried to become its own archive. That impulse, the anxious preservation of what is being lost, is familiar to every age that has ever felt itself ending. It is the impulse that libraries exist to honor. In 1922, when Howard Carter first looked through the hole into Tutankhamun's antechamber and saw the golden gleam in the darkness, what he saw first, before the golden couch, before the alabaster jars, before the famous death mask, was a small painted box. Inside the box were 2 locks of hair, one belonging to Queen Tiye, the grandmother of Tutankhamun, and one to an unidentified woman. Why a teenage boy was buried with locks of his grandmother's hair and someone else's is unknown. The interpretations range from sentiment to magic to family grief. What is undeniable is the intimacy of it. A small box of hair carried into eternity, kept close. Whatever the theology, whatever the ritual reason, someone loved someone enough to want their hair nearby in the dark. The destruction of ancient Egyptian sites continues today. The illegal antiquities trade is one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in the world, and Egypt is among its most heavily targeted countries. Objects excavated illegally and sold through black market channels end up in private collections, and sometimes in major museums, their provenance obscured, their context destroyed forever. Every object removed without documentation is a sentence of the past that cannot be read. Every looted site is an archive burned. The people doing the looting are often poor and desperate, working in conditions of poverty that the ancient monuments did nothing to relieve. The trade that destroys the past is driven by the same inequality that has always driven the gap between the people who built the monuments and the people who paid for them. The ancient Egyptians had a complex relationship with their own mythology. They held contradictory stories simultaneously without feeling the need to resolve them. The creation of the world, for example, was attributed to multiple creator gods in different traditions: Atum at Heliopolis, Ptah at Memphis, Amun at Thebes. Each tradition was locally authoritative, and none was suppressed by the others. The Egyptians seemed to understand, at some level, that different stories could be true in different ways, that the multiplicity of explanations reflected the multiplicity of the mystery being explained. This is, in contemporary terms, a quite sophisticated epistemological position. They held their certainties lightly. They built massive stone monuments to things they did not entirely understand, and they seem to have considered that an appropriate response to the incomprehensible. It may, in fact, be the most appropriate response there is. The ancient process of making papyrus involved cutting the triangular stem of the cyperus papyrus plant at a certain point above the root, peeling away the outer rind, and slicing the inner pith into thin strips using a sharp blade. These strips were laid side by side on a flat surface. Then a second layer was placed perpendicular on top. The layers were pressed firmly, traditionally, by pounding with a mallet, and the natural sugars in the pith acted as a glue, bonding the layers together as they dried in the sun. The resulting sheet was then polished with a smooth stone to create a writing surface. A skilled papyrus maker could produce sheets of consistent quality and size. The sheets were joined at their edges to make scrolls that could be rolled for storage or cut into individual pages. The entire process, from plant to writing surface, took approximately 2 weeks. The desert west of the Nile, the Sahara, the Red Land was not simply a barrier or a threat. It was a theological space. The Egyptians placed their cemeteries and their mortuary temples on the west bank, in the direction of the setting sun, because the west was the place of death and transformation. But the desert also held things. The Siwa oasis, where Alexander consulted the oracle of Amun, the white desert of Farafra, where the wind has carved chalk formations into shapes so strange they seem architectural, the Gilf Kibir Plateau in the far southwestern corner of Egypt, where prehistoric cave paintings from 10,000 years ago show cattle grazing in what is now empty stone. The desert carries a deeper memory than the monuments. Beneath the sand, there is a wet world that the sand has swallowed. Egypt's past goes further down than the pyramids reach. The priests of the Sun Temple at Heliopolis, the most ancient and venerated of all Egyptian religious sites, associated with Ra and the primordial mound, performed rituals 3 times a day, at dawn, noon, and dusk. The morning ritual involved breaking the seal on the sanctuary's inner door, opening it to allow the god's statue to receive the rising sun's first light, washing and clothing and feeding the statue, and then resealing the door. The noon ritual was simpler, a brief offering and prayer. The sunset ritual was the most elaborate, involving the symbolic closing and protection of the god as he descended into the underworld for his nightly journey. This cycle was maintained, without interruption, for the entire 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. Then it stopped. The sun did not notice. It kept rising. The ancient Egyptian city of Memphis, the first capital of unified Egypt, located near modern Cairo, was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world for over 2,000 years. It was the administrative center of the Old Kingdom, a major religious site throughout the pharaonic period, and a city of perhaps 500,000 people at its height. Today, almost nothing of it remains above ground. It was systematically quarried for building material during the medieval period, its limestone and granite stripped and used in Cairo and elsewhere. What survives is largely underground and incompletely excavated. A colossal statue of Ramesses II lies on its back in a garden. A few stone fragments, a sphinx. That is what remains of the city that stood at the center of a civilization for 2 millennia. The impermanence of cities, even great ones, is the most sobering lesson history offers. An ancient Egyptian calendar marked unlucky days, days when the gods had suffered some misfortune in mythological time, which made the corresponding calendar date dangerous for the living. On these days, Egyptians were advised not to go out at night, not to eat certain foods, not to begin new projects. The advice was specific. On one day, do not eat fish. On another, do not leave your house in the evening. The calendar survives in a papyrus that lists each day of the year as good, bad or very bad, with the mythological reason appended. It is the world's oldest surviving almanac. It is also, in its specificity and practicality, its combination of divine anxiety and household caution, a very charming document. The ancient Egyptians were afraid of bad days too. They just had a more elaborate taxonomy for them. The Ptolemaic Temple of Hathor at Dendera, built largely between 54 BCE and 20 CE, making it one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian temples, contains, in a small chamber on the roof, a series of astronomical reliefs that constitute one of the most detailed records of ancient Egyptian astronomical knowledge. The Dendera zodiac, already mentioned earlier in our journey, is part of this complex. But the temple also contains depictions of what some researchers have controversially identified as light bulbs or electrical devices, a reading almost universally rejected by mainstream Egyptologists, who identify the images as standard lotus and serpent religious imagery. The temple at Dendera rewards careful attention precisely because it is so complete. It allows us to see how an entire ancient religious complex functioned as an integrated system of architecture, ritual, image, and text. Nothing in it is accidental. Nothing in it is simple. The last pharaoh of a native Egyptian dynasty before the Ptolemies was Nectanebo II, who fled Egypt when the Persians invaded in 343 BCE. He escaped to Upper Egypt, then to Nubia, and there the historical record loses him. In later legend, he was said to have traveled to Macedonia, where he became the court magician of King Philip II and seduced Queen Olympias, becoming, in this tradition, the true father of Alexander the Great. The story is entirely legendary, but it is a fascinating legend. The last native pharaoh of Egypt, wandering into obscurity, reappearing in myth as the father of the man who would conquer Egypt and declare himself its new pharaoh. History and mythology circle each other in the ancient world in ways that are never entirely separable. The line between what happened and what people needed to believe happened is always thinner than we think. There are over 40 ancient Egyptian words for the concept we translate as love. The language distinguished between different kinds of attachment, different intensities of feeling, different relationships between love and desire and longing and devotion. The word used for a parent's love of a child was different from the word for romantic love, which was different from the word for love of one's homeland, which was different again from the love of a god for creation. This precision of emotional vocabulary is one of the most striking things about the Egyptian language. It suggests a people who paid close attention to the different textures of feeling and who believed that naming something accurately was itself a form of honoring it. The Egyptians took love seriously enough to give it 40 words. That seems right to me. The site of Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank of the Nile, contains one of Egypt's most extraordinary architectural achievements, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, designed by her architect Senenmut, rising in 3 dramatic colonnaded terraces against the sheer limestone cliff. It also contains one of the ancient world's most disturbing mass graves. In 1997, Islamic extremists attacked a group of tourists visiting the temple, killing 62 people in a massacre that traumatized Egypt and the global archaeological community simultaneously. The site had seen violence before the deliberate erasure of Hatshepsut's image, the burning of the temple in the Coptic period, the tomb robberies of the ancient world. But the 1997 attack was different. It was aimed not at the monuments, but at the act of visiting them, at the relationship between the living and the ancient dead. It targeted wonder itself. The ancient Egyptians had a creation myth in which the creator god Atum brought the universe into being through an act of self-stimulation, after which he sneezed or spat out the first 2 divine children, Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. This is recorded in the religious texts with complete seriousness and no apparent self-consciousness. The Egyptians were not prudish. Their mythology addressed sexuality and bodily functions with a directness that later Mediterranean cultures, particularly after the influence of Platonic philosophy and then Abrahamic religion, would find startling. The fertility god Min is depicted in a state of permanent arousal. The god of creation spat out the universe. The religious texts of ancient Egypt are, in places, profoundly earthy, a reminder that the people who built the most austere and magnificent monuments in the ancient world were not themselves austere. They were embodied, alive, and entirely comfortable with it. The Egyptian word Kemet, the Black Land, was the Egyptians' name for their own country. It distinguished their home from Deshret, the Red Land, the barren desert on either side. This naming tells us something fundamental about how the ancient Egyptians understood their world, not as a nation in the modern sense, defined by ethnicity or language or borders, but as a geographical condition, the narrow strip of fertility along the Nile, defined by its contrast with the hostile environment surrounding it. Egypt was, in this self-understanding, simply the place where the good soil was, the place where the flood had been, the place where life was possible. Everything else was outside. That clarity of identity grounded in soil rather than abstraction gave Egyptian civilization a coherence and a continuity that more ideologically defined cultures rarely achieved. Standing at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, in person, in the early morning before the crowds arrive, is described by nearly everyone who has done it as one of the overwhelming experiences of a human life. The scale of it cannot be adequately represented in photographs. Each stone block at the base is roughly chest height. The pyramid rises above you at an angle that seems too steep to be solid, too large to be a single-built object. It seems more like a geological feature than a human construction. The silence around it, before the tour buses arrive, is the silence of enormous age. The light on the limestone in the early morning is golden and slightly unreal. Thousands of people over thousands of years have stood in exactly this position and felt the same thing. The combination of scale and antiquity that produces an emotion for which we do not have a single adequate word. Among the most unexpected treasures from ancient Egypt are the graffiti left by New Kingdom tourists visiting the ancient sites of the Old Kingdom pyramids and temples already as old to them as medieval cathedrals are to us. One visitor left this inscription at Giza, written in the Demotic script of his own era: "I came to see the great monuments, and my heart was satisfied." Another, visiting the tomb of a great official from the Old Kingdom, wrote, "I found this tomb to be like heaven within." These people were not archaeologists or scholars. They were curious travelers, doing what humans have always done when they encounter something made long before their birth and likely to outlast them. They stopped. They looked. They wrote their names. They tried to say what it felt like. It felt, apparently, like heaven. The ancient Egyptians lived in close proximity to death in ways that modern life largely screens out. Infant mortality was high. Many children did not survive their first years. Life expectancy was short. The bodies of the recently dead were prepared at home before being taken to the embalming workshop. The smell of the mummification process, natron, resin, decomposition, was part of the sensory landscape of towns. The funerary priests, the embalmers, the tomb builders were a visible and significant sector of the workforce. Death was not something that happened elsewhere, in hospitals and funeral homes, invisibly. It happened in the house, in the neighborhood, in the field. The elaborate preparations for the afterlife were, among other things, a cultural technology for managing this proximity, making the inevitable bearable by making it meaningful. The Egyptian god Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom, writing, and knowledge, was credited in mythology with the invention of writing, mathematics, medicine, magic, and philosophy. He was the divine scribe who recorded the verdict at the judgment of the dead. He was the mediator between the gods in conflict, specifically. He brokered the settlement between Horus and Set after their long, violent dispute over the throne of Egypt. He was also, according to some traditions, responsible for controlling the moon. The Greeks identified him with Hermes, their messenger god, creating the hybrid figure Hermes Trismegistus, credited in the medieval and Renaissance tradition with a body of mystical and philosophical writings called the Hermetica. Thoth, an ibis-headed Egyptian god, is a direct ancestor of the Western esoteric tradition. The bird walks through a very long history. The modern study of ancient Egypt, Egyptology, was effectively born with Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822, but it has been dramatically transformed by technology in recent decades. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed structures beneath the sand that have never been excavated. Satellite imagery has identified ancient canal networks and buried towns invisible from ground level. CT scanning of mummies has allowed detailed study of ancient diseases, injuries, and diet without damaging the remains. DNA analysis has traced the genetic heritage of ancient Egyptians, finding that the mummies from the New Kingdom period show genetic affinities with ancient Near Eastern peoples rather than with sub-Saharan African populations, a finding that addresses long-standing debates about the ethnic identity of the ancient Egyptians. The conversation between the ancient world and modern science is ongoing, and the ancient world, remarkably, keeps answering. Tonight we have walked the Black Land together, and it has been a long and extraordinary walk. We stood in the shadow of the pyramids when they were still being built, and heard the shouts of the work gangs echoing across the Giza Plateau. We sat with Hatshepsut as she sent her ships to Punt, and with Ramesses as he rode toward Kadesh. We watched Akhenaten reshape a civilization and be erased from it. We opened, with Howard Carter, the sealed door of a boy king's tomb and saw, for the first time in 3,000 years, the golden gleam of wonderful things. We listened to the last hieroglyph being carved at Philae, and then stood in the long silence that followed it. We said the names of the dead. We have been very far away and very long ago, and what we found there was not so different from what we carry here. If tonight's journey offered you a softer place to land, if the Nile carried you somewhere quieter than where the day left you, I'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing so that other tired travelers can find their way here too. A simple click, and someone else gets to fall asleep inside history. Let your hands grow still now, wherever they are resting. Feel the weight of your arms, the heaviness that has been building through this long night. Let your thoughts slow to the pace of the Nile, unhurried, moving always in one direction, carrying what it carries without effort. The pyramids are still standing out there in the dark. The desert wind is still moving across the sand. The stars that the Egyptians called by name are still overhead, unchanged. You have traveled 3,000 years tonight and found that the past is warm and inhabited and full of people who loved their children and feared the dark and wondered what comes next, exactly as you do. Now let the dark be gentle. Let the wondering pause. You are here. You are safe. The history will still be there when you wake. Sleep well, and good night.